Friendship is a bond that's often stronger than blood. When two people grow up together, share their deepest secrets, and face life's ups and downs side by side, it feels like nothing can break that connection. But what happens when the unthinkable occurs? What happens when someone you trust more than anything betrays you in the most unimaginable way? This is the chilling story of Jared and Chris, two young men who grew up together. What began as an innocent bond between best friends spiraled into a web of obsession, manipulation, and murder, a twisted path that would tear apart their lives forever. It all started in the quiet neighborhood where Jared and Chris lived. They were inseparable from the start, friends, companions, and brothers in every sense of the word. Growing up next door to each other, they spent nearly every waking moment together. They played sports, spent late nights chatting, and shared everything, from their favorite music to their deepest fears. Jared was always at Chris's house, as much a part of the family as Chris himself. Linda, Chris's mother, was kind-hearted and welcoming. To Jared, she was like a second mother. He admired her for her warmth and the way she always treated him with a genuine care he hadn't often found elsewhere. But as they entered their teenage years, things began to change in ways Jared could neither explain nor understand. He started to notice Linda differently in ways he never had before. It wasn't something overt, not at first. It was the way she smiled at him, the way she paid attention to his thoughts and feelings, as though she saw him in a way no one else did. It made him uncomfortable. He tried to ignore it. After all, Linda was Chris's mother, and he could never imagine thinking of her in any other way. But the more time Jared spent at Chris's house, the more his thoughts about Linda became all-consuming. He began to feel something stirring inside him whenever she was around, something more than just the friendly affection he'd always had for her. The guilt gnawed at him. Was this normal? Was he just lonely, or was something darker pulling at him? Every time their eyes met, every time she laughed at something he said, it made him want to be closer to her in a way he knew he shouldn't. Linda, too, began to notice a shift in Jared. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, something more than the innocent affection of a boy to his friend's mother. She tried to push it out of her mind. She had a family, a marriage, a life that had nothing to do with Jared's fleeting teenage crushes. But there was something about him that made her feel alive again, something about his youth and energy that awakened parts of her she thought had long since faded. She found herself drawn to him in a way that terrified her. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that it was a passing fancy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Jared was becoming someone she couldn't resist. Then, one evening, everything changed. Chris was away for the night, and Jared found himself at Linda's house, as he often did. They were sitting in the living room, reminiscing about old times, when the tension between them became palpable. There was something in the air, a thick, unspoken energy that neither of them could deny. As the conversation slowed, their eyes locked, and for the first time, Jared saw Linda not as a motherly figure, but as a woman, beautiful, desirable, and out of reach. Without thinking, his hand brushed against hers. The simple touch sent a shock through both of them. Before either could pull away, their lips met in a kiss. It was not a kiss of passion or desire at first, but it grew into one, a forbidden surge of emotion neither of them had prepared for. Jared felt an intoxicating rush, as though he had crossed a line into a world he didn't understand but couldn't pull himself away from. Linda felt the same, confused, guilty, but also stirred by a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. They broke apart quickly, both of them breathless, but the damage was done. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. From that moment on, everything changed. The kiss had ignited something in them both, something they couldn't contain. They began a secret affair, sneaking around Chris, hiding their meetings and conversations. Jared became consumed by Linda in a way that he had never imagined. He could think of nothing else but her. The feel of her touch, the taste of her kiss. It wasn't just an affair anymore. It was an obsession. His mind, his heart, and every part of his being were now tangled up in Linda, and the guilt he once felt seemed to fade with each passing day. But the more obsessed Jared became, the more isolated he became from everything else. He stopped hanging out with his other friends. He grew distant, cold even. Chris, noticing the changes in Jared, grew concerned. This wasn't the same person who had always been by his side. Jared was no longer the carefree, fun-loving guy he had once known. He had become dark, withdrawn. Chris reached out, asking if everything was okay, but Jared brushed him off, offering vague explanations and excuses. Still, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jared had begun to spend more time at his house than ever before, but he and Linda were always alone. Chris couldn't explain it, but something didn't sit right. Then, one evening, during dinner, Chris said the words that would change everything. "You two seem awfully cozy together." "What's going on?" he joked, his voice light. "You're practically acting like a couple." The words hung in the air, more cutting than Chris could have ever realized. Jared's blood ran cold. His face went pale. It wasn't an accusation, but it hit him like a sledgehammer. He felt exposed, cornered. Could Chris already suspect something? He had to get control of the situation. He couldn't let this secret come out. He couldn't risk losing Linda. Not now. Not after everything. The guilt that had been simmering inside Jared suddenly gave way to something darker. He realized he couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified that someone would find out. Chris's words lingered in his mind, twisting into something far more sinister. He couldn't lose Linda, and he couldn't let Chris get in the way of their future together. If Chris was a threat, then Jared had no choice but to eliminate him. At first, the thought seemed impossible. He could never hurt his best friend. But the more Jared thought about it, the more it made sense. If Chris were out of the picture, then Linda would be his. The obsession that had consumed him grew until it seemed like the only logical course of action. He had to act. The next evening, Jared invited Chris over, just like old times. They spent hours reminiscing, drinking beer, laughing, but the entire time, Jared was planning. He could feel his heart pounding as the moment drew nearer. It came when Chris, slightly drunk, made another casual remark about Jared's behavior. This was it. Without warning, Jared grabbed a metal rod from the corner of the room and swung it with all his strength. The blow hit Chris in the head, sending him stumbling backward in shock. Before Chris could react, Jared struck again, harder this time. Blood poured from Chris's skull as he crumpled to the floor. For a moment, Jared just stood there, staring at his best friend's body. His mind was a whirl of disbelief and fear, but there was no time to waste. He couldn't leave Chris's body for anyone to find. It had to disappear. Jared set the body on fire, watching as the flames consumed everything. The heat would burn away all evidence, all traces that could ever link him to the crime. By the time the fire died down, there was nothing left but ash. Jared pretended to mourn, to be lost in the tragedy of losing his best friend, but inside he felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The deed was done, or so he thought, but as the days passed, Linda began to grow more distant. She noticed the changes in Jared, the coldness that had taken over him. She started to question him, asking why he seemed so different, why he was acting strange. Jared could see the doubt in her eyes. She was starting to suspect something was wrong, and that was the one thing he couldn't allow. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything. So one night, he went to Linda's house. She was sitting alone, her face filled with worry. Jared didn't say a word. He didn't give her a chance to speak. He attacked her just as he had done to Chris, and within moments, she was gone. He set her body on fire, making sure there was no trace of her left. The fear, the doubt, the guilt, it all evaporated as the flames consumed her. But there was one more person who could ruin everything. Tyler, Jared's cousin. Tyler had started asking too many questions, piecing together the details of Chris and Linda's deaths. Jared knew he couldn't let that continue, so he lured Tyler to a secluded spot, pretending to want to reconcile. When Tyler arrived, Jared struck again, this time strangling him until there was no life left in his body. Once again, he set the body on fire, watching as the flames devoured everything. Jared believed he had gotten away with it all. The police were no closer to uncovering the truth. No one suspected him. How could they? He was a grieving friend, a lost soul, a young man who had been through too much. But Jared didn't realize that the truth always comes to light. Secrets buried too deep will always rise to the surface. And soon, the investigation into the deaths of Chris, Linda, and Tyler began to unravel the threads of Jared's dark past. His affair with Linda was discovered, and the motive behind the murders became clear. When Jared was finally arrested, the community was left in shock. How could someone so familiar, so trusted, have committed such horrific acts? Jared's obsession, his need for control, had driven him to madness, and in the end, it cost him everything. Jared was sentenced to life in prison. His story, a tragic tale of obsession, manipulation, and murder, served as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from the people we least expect, those who hide their darkness behind a mask of normalcy. In the end, Jared's descent into madness, fueled by his obsessive love for Linda, led him to destroy everything he had ever cared about.